from what I've seen is that people aren't caught up in ideology. You've got people from the right and the left that they're really just looking at it the way they see it and reporting it the way they see it.
As President-elect Barack Obama assembles his new administration, foreign policy will be high on the agenda. One of the most critical issues facing him will be Latin America. Latin America has been, in some people's eyes, quote, spiraling out of America's control. If you look at it from a Latin American point of view, it will be, for once, Latin America is asserting its independence. Whichever is the case, Obama is going to have to decide how to improve relations with most of the Latin American countries. Joining us now to analyze the situation is Real News analyst Forrest Hylton. Forrest is also the author of the book, Evil Hour in Colombia. Thanks for joining us, Forrest.
Good to be here, Paul.
So, first of all, how did Latin America react to the election of Barack Obama?
I think the reaction was largely positive, particularly from leaders like Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez, which have broken off diplomatic relations with the United States and are looking forward to reestablishing relations with the new administration. And at the same time, there are a number of people who say that although it's a step forward for the United States to have elected an African-American president, many in Latin America would put the emphasis on American in the sense of the duties that come with being in charge of the U.S. empire, which is what it entails to be president of the United States. So Latin Americans are very aware of the imperial dimensions of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. And at the same time, Obama's spokesperson on Latin American issues, Dan Restrepo, is quite aware that the U.S. policies on Latin America need to change, and that they need to change now because realities in Latin America have changed dramatically, and U.S. policies are completely out of step with those realities.
You know, Barack Obama, and during the debates with McCain, used language like calling Venezuela a rogue nation, repeated a lot of the traditional language about Cuba and the evils of the Castro dictatorship. And some people have suggested, well, this is what you have to say to get elected, especially if you're worried about winning in Florida, although I'm not sure it really won much of the Cuban vote in Florida anyway. But what do you see any kind of new vision towards Latin America from Obama, given the kind of campaign rhetoric he's been delivering?
This is what's interesting. I mean, the campaign rhetoric certainly wouldn't lead you to expect any really important changes. It's obvious that he's not going to be as belligerent as Bush is, and that he adopts a different tone and discourse altogether than Bush does. But at the same time, I think the question really is the extent to which his spokesperson on Latin American issues, Dan Restrepo, is going to have any real influence in a new Obama administration. Dan Restrepo is somebody who got his start as a Democratic House staffer in the House Foreign Relations Committee during Clinton's first term. So he's somebody who knows Washington and policy making and people in Latin America from the height of the period of the Washington Consensus, and he understands that neoliberal policies that were embraced by Latin American elites for their own reasons have been a total disaster for the majority of Latin American people. Restrepo is somebody who sees these new kind of popular governments in Latin America as a step forward, and he understands the need for redistribution of wealth and resources of Latin America to lessen inequality and lessen poverty. So this already is a huge step forward. The question is, how carefully is Obama going to be listening to his main spokesperson on Latin America, and how much energy and time is he going to have to devote to Latin American issues?
Well,
what's good about Restrepo is that he knows that in Washington there's almost never sufficient time and energy devoted to America's policy, and I think it's safe to say that it will be his mission to get people in Washington to take Latin America and developments there more seriously.
How does this global financial meltdown affect all of this? Because we're talking a whole new game here. There was, just before the big crash, you had, of course, China becoming one of the major trading partners with almost all the Latin American countries. You had a move by Russia in many ways, most noticeably with Venezuela and a new military arms agreement. But now, like, everything is kind of up for grabs again now. Like, can Russia actually afford all this deal with Venezuela now with the drop in the price of oil and the run on the ruble? And of course the American position is even more fragile in terms of having less of clout to play with in Latin America, given the American economy is unraveling. Does anybody actually know how this might unfold?
Well, I think what we can expect from an Obama administration, if Dan Restrepo is actually able to influence policy in any way, is a much more pragmatic and flexible approach. Restrepo's father was a Colombian economist who came to the United States at the behest of JFK's wise men in order to help implement the Alliance for Progress. And Restrepo himself is very outspoken about the need to increase the amount of social investment and decrease the amount of military aid to Colombia, and to really make the focus on the development of people in Latin America. Whether or not that will take place is another issue altogether, and it's linked to the question of immigration reform, because obviously the conditions that resulted from the application of neoliberal policies is what led to the largest wave of migration in the country's history in the 1990s. Restrepo is somebody who understands this and has spoken about it in some of his policy papers.
Now, so is there a possibility Restrepo could become Undersecretary of State for Latin America? And then if so, that would say a lot, I guess.
I wouldn't be surprised if he was, because he really does have expertise. Like Obama, he's an Ivy League lawyer with a real taste for nuts and bolts of policymaking. So, in a way, they're kind of kindred souls, and they really both are sort of pragmatic, flexible liberals in the mode of the Kennedy administration. And that would signal a sort of return to so-called realism in American foreign policy, which was what dominated under Kennedy's administration. But the problem with that is the way that it combines civic action, which is to say social investment, with counterinsurgency and the continued combating of popular movements in the name of the war on drugs. But Restrepo was a very outspoken opponent of the application of the idea of the global war on terror to Latin America. And I think that the financial crisis creates the conditions whereby a flexible, pragmatic approach, as advocated by Restrepo, might actually carry more weight in Washington, which has been so heavily ideological, obviously, since the Bush administration took over. So
Are we in an era now where policy has to catch up with reality? And what I mean by that now, rather than being America's backyard and Monroe Doctrine and all of this, that the United States is now just one of several major countries that are going to interact with some major Latin American economies. And does the consciousness and policy in Washington have to catch up with this now?
This is exactly what Restrepo himself is arguing. So he's really got his work cut out for him to convince people in Washington that this is the case and that dramatic policy departures are required. And he really seems like a man on a cause, and one can understand, given his whole sort of family history and how it is he came to the United States himself. But there is no question that either the U.S. gets in now or it's going to be shut out by its competitors. And as I said, I think that the financial crisis might actually create some space for a less heavily ideological position and a more open and flexible posture towards negotiations, aid and trade and development. And I think if the U.S. begins putting forth proposals for development that can compete with what Russia is offering and what China is offering, particularly given how Russia and China are going to be affected by this global economic recession, the United States might actually be able to work its way back into Latin America. And again, I think that is the job that Restrepo will have if he is going to be continue to be Obama's spokesperson on Latin American issues, and if he is given a cabinet post. How he is able to fare in Washington is another thing altogether.
Well, we'll be watching very closely to see whether he gets the undersecretary job or not. Thank you very much for joining us, Forrest, and thanks
for having me, Paul.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network. And again, watch for the donate button, because we can't keep doing this if you don't support us. Thank you very much.
This is the sort of thing we can build right now without anyone else's permission from the government or from the business community. It's the power's in our hands.
If we're not going to sleepwalk into more wars and into environmental disaster, we think we need to start with a television news network that won't bow to pressure and has the courage to seek facts. And that means independent economics. And that's why we need you.
Real hope means facing a complex reality. Your tax-deductible donation makes it possible. Please contribute. Visit therealnews.com.